So if you allow me, I will introduce each of them one by one, and each of them will have a few minutes to present, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A afterwards. Our first speaker is Aurora Almendral, who is a Filipino-American journalist and writer based in London. She has worked in over 30 countries from Somalia to Mexico and has lived in Thailand, Spain, New York, and the Philippines, where she maintains a home in Cebu. Her journalism has been published by the New York Times and National Geographic magazine, and has been recognized with multiple awards, including from the Overseas Press Club of America and the Hillman Prize for Investigative Journalism. She is currently working on her first book. Our second author and panelist is Marga Ortigas, who is a veteran international journalist and best-selling author from Manila. After decades of reporting from the front lines of conflict and climate change for CNN and Al Jazeera, she stepped away from the camera and focused on the page, with her first 4 books published by Penguin Random House Southeast Asia. She was a British Council Chevening Scholar and was awarded by the International Committee of the Red Cross for humanitarian reporting on the Philippines. A storyteller at heart, Marga continues to write, both nonfiction and fiction, with the urgency of a journalist and the intimacy of a poet. Dorian S. Merina is a poet, journalist, and translator who lives in the northern Philippines. He is the author of the award-winning book, Di at Chichuk, Poems and Images from Batanes. Merina has led a community-based project to record and document Laji, the indigenous oral poetry of Batanes. He is the co-founder of the community library, Aklatan Savidug in Sabtang, Batanes, and teaches media studies at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He is a tribal member of the Ivatan people of Batanes and is of mixed ancestry. Ladies and gentlemen, our panelists for today.
Thank you, Tanya. So my name is Aurora Almendral, and I've been a journalist for about 15 years. And a couple of years into my career, in 2013, I decided to move back to the Philippines. And I lived there from 2013 to 2020, mostly covering the Philippines for international news outlets, or American news outlets primarily, including the New York Times and National Geographic magazine. And so what I wanted to talk about is how we frame international stories and what we're trying to accomplish and actually avoid doing in an international story. And so a national audience it has different needs. They're familiar with the story, and this is very good for this sort of incremental coverage of a country that's highly necessary for a democracy, everything. An international story, they might only read 1 or 2 stories a month from the Philippines. They might not have might not have a functioning knowledge of the country and aren't updated on anything, on what's happening there. So we take a more step back approach. It's more explanatory. So what I'm aiming for is presuming interest but not knowledge about the Philippines. And there's quite well-documented risks about international storytelling, and like one of the ways that we talk about how coverage has been done incorrectly is parachute journalism, where you just send in some reporter who doesn't know anything about the country, drops in and finds all of the most common stereotypes and repeats them into the world. This is what we're not trying to do anymore, and certainly not what I was trying to do. And at worst, it's creating caricatures of people, it's confirming stereotypes, or you end up with things like poverty porn, which is terrible, or at worst, you're dehumanizing a population, which can have further ramifications of all kinds. So what I've tried to do as a reporter when I was in the Philippines was to write about Filipinos and really anyone who I covered with the same level of specificity and nuance that I saw Americans write about each other, right? So I'd read a story that another New York Times reporter wrote about like a mother in Texas, and I'm thinking, I'm writing about Filipinos in that way. I'm going to write about Somalis with that level of humanity. And so I think, the reason why I do this is that the context can be incredibly different. Like the specificity of their lives could be a million miles apart, but I think that one thing that we know intuitively as readers and as human beings is that there's universality in the motives that people have and the emotions that drive how they do things. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of stories that I did that really resonated with an international audience about the Philippines and Filipino people. And this first one is The Lonely and Dangerous Life of the Filipino Seafarer, which was, this photograph is by the Filipino photojournalist Jess Asnar, and we spent 10 days on a cement carrier in the northern Pacific. And on some level, this is just an adventure story. That is fun for anybody, like a tale of adventure, an insight into this world that you don't know anything about necessarily. Who gets to ride in a cargo ship, right? It's very difficult to do. It took me months to get access. And also, but here's this other thing, is that the majority of the seafarers for decades are Filipino, and they spend 10 or 11 months on this ship, and they bring Filipino culture with them. So this is the next slide, and this is lechon, which is, I'm from Cebu, and this is our national food, just a spit-roasted pig. The unofficial national sport of the Philippines is basketball, and many of these cargo ships have basketball hoops installed in them because we're playing basketball. We're Filipino and we're playing basketball. This is kind of them waiting around to set sail. And then this final photo is one of the main characters who I'll talk about later, trying to connect with his daughter. And this is, and a lot of the themes here resonate: the sacrifice, the striving. These are people who are trying to improve their lives better than the one that they were born into. And but there's also loneliness and this longing for home. And then when I was writing this story, and I was thinking about the Odyssey, right? Odysseus, he went out, tried to prove himself in the war, and then spent a decade trying to come home to his wife and his son. And this is, it's not, the feelings are not just universal, they're eternal. This is an epic poem that we're still reading to this day, 4,000 years old maybe, and you still see the same things, kind of playing out in these seafarers' lives. And this guy is John Russell Rayonier, and I opened the story with him shoveling bauxite in the bottom of a massive cargo ship for 12 hours. And he cried after 3 hours and then worked for 9 hours more. Goes back to his room and he cries again. But 10 years later, when I meet him on this ship, he has this daughter. And now what he's trying to do is come home. And there's this sense on the ship, everybody worked so hard to get this job, and then on the ship they're just looking out into this horizon with this home that's forever out of reach. And so I think that it's one of the stories that got 1 million views or whatever it is in the New York Times, and I think that it's because it plays into these universal emotions. The next slide, please. The next story is it's an explanatory feature on why there are so many teen mothers in the Philippines. The Philippines has one of the highest birth rates in Asia. I think it's second only to Afghanistan. And around the time of this story, the Philippine government had decided that they needed to do a better job of managing the population. And the finding was that once you have your first child as a teen mother, it makes it harder for you to get out of poverty. And this is for NPR, another U.S. outlet, and this really resonated with readers in America because at the time in the U.S. there was a lot of debate around Roe versus Wade, which is a Supreme Court decision around abortion that was eventually overturned. So people are thinking about bodily autonomy and how being put into a position where you have to have children when you're not ready and how that resonates within your life. Can you push the next slide, please? I don't know if I mentioned, but the photos were taken by Hannah Reyes Morales. Really gorgeous photographs, and it's about motherhood, and the places are really different. You know, this woman, her name is Joanne. She lives on some rafts in Manila Bay. The other one, she lives in the cemetery. This is the most crowded maternity ward in the world, Fabea. And of course, the Catholic Church looms very large over the really decade-long fight for reproductive rights in the Philippines. So this is one of the main churches in the Philippines in Quiapo. And I think, you know, that this story, I'd never gotten so many letters, that so many people just trying to find ways to donate to these women, like really connected with them. And I think this is because even though the specificities of their life were different, you know, I think women in general understood the profound impact that a pregnancy they aren't ready for can have on their lives. And then I have a number of other stories that also were quite popular, that you know, resonated with an international audience. But I think the one that I'm going to focus on is this one, the clipping on the far left side. And it's about this neighborhood in the Philippines that's inside the fish port, and it's called Market 3, and it's inside the fish port in Manila, and it's, you know, it's a really humble shantytown neighborhood, and when we were covering Duterte, we were spending a lot of time, you know, Duterte, who had this killing campaign against drug users and dealers. And so many of the people, you know, would spend all night kind of chasing the police around to see where the next body was. And so many of them were in Market 3, where so many people were killed in that area. And I'd spent a lot of time there covering that. And I wanted to be able to tell a different kind of story about the people, about Market 3. And to this day, I cannot believe that the New York Times let me write a love story about two 15-year-olds, totally unknown, in this slum in Manila. And you know, you see the family there. That's the two people who are, you know, this is the love story, that boy and girl, and you see kind of Market 3 through the girl's eyes. Mary, her name is Mary, and she had always she thought of this place as full of degenerates, and she was never going to step foot there. But she fell in love with this boy, and she decided to see what it was like. Go in there and check it out. And she said, I didn't realize that life was better inside. It's this close, warm community. And of course their lives are difficult. Of course somebody who's in Iowa in America is not going to be able to connect with maybe what their house is made out of. But I think that there are a lot of people who connected with just the idea of love, of finding, of trying to make a life in this place where there are terrible things happening, but there's also joy. There's suffering, but there's also love. And this is another story where I got a lot of emails from the US, but I also got a lot of emails from places like Brazil and India, and they really connected with it, you know, because they were seeing something that you know, people that maybe they thought people in their own countries also lived lives like this, and to see them covered in a way that's different from, oh, these poor people, look what's happening to them. It's just, you know, a fuller, hopefully, image of a life. I think they really appreciated that, and I did, because it showed that the coverage wasn't Western-centric. And also Filipinos themselves really connected with it and wrote in saying they appreciated seeing Filipinos covered with humanity, and that to me has become one of the markers of success, is when an international story also resonates with people at home.
Thank you, Aurora. Marga?
Hi, I'm Marga Ortigas. If we can have the first slide, please. We're pretty much going to talk very similar themes here because as journalists, I'm sure you'll see after we speak that we all work with the same kind of intention and the same kind of goal. So I thought I would attack this a little differently by telling you how somebody like me from Manila, for example, from the Philippines, ended up working for international news channels, telling international stories, and then using what I learned from that to tell Philippine stories to an international audience. Next slide, please. So when I was growing up in Manila in the 80s, many people outside the country, in fact, majority of people outside the country, knew very little about the Philippines, other than perhaps Madam Imelda Marcos, or overseas Filipino workers who were already beginning to migrate to Europe, across America, to other parts of Asia, and of course the Middle East. But those Filipinos who were going abroad were still getting questions like, do you live in tree houses? Or do you know what a car is? Do you drive horse carriages? So there was very little known about this tiny little country in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in Southeast Asia. For those of us growing up there, what we saw on TV, for example, a lot of it was canned from the United States. Australia was considered very, very strange and far away for us. So we were getting American shows full of American actors telling American stories. So for someone like me growing up at that time, what did that tell me? It told me that my stories didn't really matter. They were irrelevant, they were immaterial, and they were pretty much invisible. There was nobody who looked like me. There was nobody who was portraying a reality that is maybe what we were seeing. And we were also at that time having just come out of martial law. So the first time that we might have seen the Philippines, at least for somebody like me, on the international news arena, it was on CNN during the People Power Revolt in 1986. So then it was our stories, but being told to us by outsiders. So the goal for somebody like me then growing up was, well, I want to be a storyteller, so therefore, I want to be a storyteller on CNN. Next slide, please. How the heck does that happen when you're growing up thousands of miles away from Atlanta, Georgia, which is where CNN was headquartered? Somehow I managed to end up on a local news channel. But still, the goal was very, very far away, didn't think it would happen. But working in local news in the Philippines, we were dealing with local stories, talking to a local audience, and at that point, that was the extent of the work that I was doing until I got a scholarship to go and study in London. That eventually did lead me to land a role with CNN in the London Bureau, which was beyond even a dream come true for somebody like me. Like I said, growing up in a country that was so far away, that felt invisible. And yet somehow that invisibility I discovered while working with CNN in London could work for the storyteller, could work particularly for the journalist, because your whole point of existence is to kind of be invisible so that you can tell somebody else's story and get them to trust you enough to tell you their truths. And the good thing about that was being, I suppose, of ambiguous ethnicity, you might say. When I was at CNN in London, they sent me to the Middle East. The whole time I was there, I spent a year in Iraq, and then I was also in Gaza, was the back of my head thinking, what the heck am I doing here? Like with people that I grew up watching, I was suddenly working with them to tell stories about a place in the world that was so, so different from where I was from. But what I learned from that was that because I was so different, nobody knew what to do with me, or there were no preconceived ideas of who I was, so nobody thought I might have an agenda if I was somewhere covering a story. So I got sent a lot, even to US military briefings, because they didn't know who I was, so there was no kind of bravado, there was no showing off because, hey, we're fellow Americans. There was none of that. But they also sent me out to tell the stories of the Iraqis who were the victims of this war, of this occupation, really, that they didn't ask for. And they would talk to me because I didn't look American, I didn't look Western, so for them, especially in the beginning, I wasn't the enemy. I wasn't the invader, so there was no judgment also of who I was to sit there and talk to them and ask them what their reality might be, and to give me the kind of honor of telling me their truth so I could then relay that on CNN. And what I learned in a place so far removed from where I grew up and being invisible was that in listening, there was a deep, deep empathy that I could kind of utilize to use their stories on the air to try to exhibit that there is a universality among us. So in talking to all the people I met in the Middle East of differing backgrounds, of differing realities, of even different ethnicities, was that we all had common realities. There were common themes in all of our daily lives. There was loss, there was love, there was injustice, there was power that people were struggling against, and there was resilience. So there were similarities. And in that, I thought, maybe then I am not so ill-equipped to tell somebody else's story, because we shared things that went deeper than race, deeper than borders, deeper than geography, deeper than geopolitics. Next slide, please. So after a few years, I was with CNN for about 6 years. Al Jazeera decided to launch an English channel. And because I had been in the Middle East, I had heard about Al Jazeera. At that point, many Western countries saw it as a terrorist network. And in fact, I was asked by many, why would you leave CNN to work for the terrorist network? But the thing is, journalists, particularly in London at the time, knew exactly what Al Jazeera was, and the last thing it was a terrorist network. They were doing very important work and telling stories of people that were very rarely heard on international news channels. And a lot of us who were working for example, CNN, even the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, at the time, decided, hey, why not start a whole new venture where we're not having to toe a Western line, where we are free to basically tell the stories of the voiceless. So I joined Al Jazeera, and with that I thought, I'm going to take everything I learned working in Europe, working in the Middle East about telling stories, and return to Asia. I went back to Manila then after 10 years in Europe, and I started telling Philippine stories, Southeast Asian stories, and stories from the wider region for an international audience. And I could do that because I felt like the perspective had opened up a little bit, and I no longer felt irrelevant. I no longer felt like our stories were immaterial or invisible. There was a way to find the complexities of the Philippines and the stories in the Philippines, and get to the core of it and be able to relay it in such a way that somebody watching in Nairobi or somebody watching in Germany could understand or could relate. Exactly as Aurora said, right? You find the commonalities, you put a face to the complexities of the area, and suddenly you are then the bridge between the viewer and the person whose reality you are reporting on. So this is when we had, the Duterte government was under this time. The Super Typhoon Haiyan, where thousands and thousands of people were killed. And we were telling the story very differently from many Western outlets who unfortunately were buying into stereotypes, were reporting things as they thought they were, without really understanding the complexities. They parachuted in and then just went with, oh, there's corruption in the local government and therefore the aid is not getting through. But it was never that simple. And if you bothered to speak to the people, get to know what was happening, and even understand the complexities of the government, that didn't mean I reported it in the 2 or 3 minutes that I got to report live on TV every day. What it meant was I then diluted that, or digested that, put it that way. I digested that and repeated it to the audience in a way that I knew the international audience would understand and would care. So it wasn't about just the broad strokes of, oh, there's corruption, therefore no one's getting aid. Because that was never it was never that simple. Next slide, please. So ultimately, I think, particularly now that the world has opened up more and you have more people telling stories on news channels who are not just from Western backgrounds, the one thing that's becoming clearer is, particularly for a journalist, our point is that we have to approach every story with an openness and ability to sit and listen and make ourselves, in a sense, invisible, so that the people we are speaking to will trust us enough with their truths. this then obviously will add some empathy into the way we retell their stories so that there can be an actual exchange between the person we are reporting on and the people we are reporting to. Because ultimately our role as storytellers, be it in fiction or nonfiction, as journalists or creative artists, is to create connection between peoples. People who might think that they are very different and diverse. Because ultimately at the end of the day, if we understand each other better, there will be greater respect. And if we respect each other, there might perhaps be an easier way we can accept the differences that might be actually quite superficial. Thank you.
Thank you, Marga. Dorian?
So, although I live in the Philippines, I grew up mostly in the Filipino diaspora abroad, specifically in Los Angeles. And I'm also of mixed background, mixed ancestry. My father is Ivatan, one of the indigenous groups in the northern part of the country. My mother is German-Irish. So I am what we call in Filipino halo-halo, mix. So I just wanted to talk about, as a journalist, exploring the Philippines as a nation, as a country, through looking at the diaspora and through looking at how the diaspora relates to its homeland. And this picture, we can't go too quickly past that picture. See the cutie in the back? That is my older sister, Vanessa. That's me in the front with the cake all over my face, you know. That's my Lola, or my grandmother, on the left side. Maria Canela, my Lolo, Catalino Talino, in the back. And then in the back there is my uncle, Agapito Casanova. This was taken in California, circa 1979 or so, somewhere like that. Next slide, please. So just by way of some context, Filipinos, we have one of the largest populations comparatively to our total population who are living and working abroad, as you saw in a lot of the stories that Marga and Aurora were telling as well. More than 10% of Filipinos live and work abroad. You can see some of the numbers here, 4.5 million in the US, Canada up there. Germany, this is as of 2024, but 60,000 in Germany and other parts of Europe as well. This is not a new phenomenon. You know, we think about it with the surge in the 60s and 70s with the health care sector, but even before that, we were sending labor in the 1920s, 1930s around the world and around the globe. And even before that, we had a global presence. So our diaspora has a long history. Next slide, please. I'll just talk briefly about 3 different stories that I have done looking at the Filipino diaspora. The first one is on arts and culture. I don't know if anybody was here to see the flip top presentation a little while back, right? So that's a great expression of how hip hop is really, as we know, a global phenomenon, a global culture. But not as many people know that Filipinos were influential in the early days of hip hop, going back to the 1980s as DJs, b-boys, and also MCs as well, right? This was a story I did out of New York City, a group called Deep Foundation. And what was interesting about them is they would rap in different languages of the Philippines, but also in English. And they would talk about primarily 2 different strands in their art. And one is just the reality of urban living in New York and the struggles they went through. But the other one was this very interesting dynamic of how they related to their families and their homeland, their ancestral background in the Philippines. And they did that through their memories, they did that through talking about their families and also their migration story of how they arrived into New York. The picture on the right is from the largest festival of Philippine arts and culture in the US, which is in Los Angeles, that happens annually. And you'll see here dancers who are probably 2nd or 3rd generation Filipino American, but they are expressing their culture and their connection to the homeland through traditional dance as well. Next slide, please. This is a story I did about the farm labor and the labor rights movement in California. California, one of the largest food production regions, right, in the world, in the Central Valley especially. We tend to think of the important movement for labor rights that called for protections for farm workers in the 1960s and the 1970s that spread as a phenomenon of mostly Mexican workers, which had a very important presence. But in fact, Filipinos were there working in the fields as early as the 1920s and 30s. In the original picture you saw, which I pointed out, my uncle in the back, he came to California in the 1920s and 30s to work in the asparagus fields, the canneries up in Alaska, and the orchards in the northwest part of the US. And so they actually formed an important part of the leadership of the early farm workers movement, affecting the whole economy and agriculture through California. People like Philip Veracruz and Larry Leong and others who were a generation before figures like Cesar Chavez and others who were calling for labor rights. And through reporting on this story, we saw that Filipinos are not just recent arrivals in many of these places, but we actually have a long history, and not just a history, but we have an influential role that we have played in determining economic and labor history in the US. Next slide, please. Marga showed earlier some pictures of her coverage of Typhoon Haiyan, or known locally as Yolanda, which came through in 2013. In the Philippines. At the time, it was the strongest ever recorded typhoon on the planet. And it caused more than 6,000 deaths and tens of thousands of injuries and hundreds of thousands of people displaced through the central part of the Philippines. This was a story I did about a family that was displaced by that, one of the early examples of climate refugees. Her name is Leah Tejada, and this was done out of Los Angeles, where there's a big Filipino population. But her family is from Leyte, and her family was very hard hit by the typhoon. And they had to flee, and they had to find a new livelihood in another place. But she was constantly calling back and constantly in touch with her family back home and trying to rebuild. And we saw through following the family some of the corruption that Marga was talking about, or some of the reasons, the complex reasons why the rebuilding phase was difficult, why families were struggling to recover after this devastation. And we could view a lot of that through the diaspora as well. The picture on the right is now from my home community in Batanes. I put that in there just to also show that although we can identify a lot of the problems and conflicts that we experience as this large diaspora around the world, we can also explore and find some of the innovation and the solutions to some of our problems. And this is a traditional form of roofing in our village. I live in a place that is prone to typhoons. And last year we had 5 typhoons in 4 weeks, and 3 of them were super typhoons. So we have to develop ways to protect our community and our families. And this is as you can see, it's a traditional technology, but it's very effective. It uses local materials. Our roofs are made of grass, thick grass, bamboo. Tying material is local as well. And it's a community effort. All the neighbors come by and work together to protect the home, to fix the home. And we participate and help each other through that. And we grow the materials and we tend to the materials to make it communal. And it's very cooperative. And so I just include that as a way of noting that our character as Filipinos also is to help one another and to innovate and to use our imagination to meet the challenges of the time. And I will end it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We traveled the world from a Filipino perspective through their stories as journalists, and now they're authors consolidating their experiences in the work that they do. We will open the floor for some questions, if anybody has some questions. But maybe if I can ask, and just to put it in context, usually when Filipinos travel, and I was just on the walk with Ambeth Ocampo about Jose Rizal and where he stopped in Frankfurt, and things don't really change much with Filipinos from like hundreds of years ago and today, but part of it is, and Ambeth was also talking about an anecdote that I think still applies. When Filipinos usually travel abroad, if they meet somebody else who may look Filipino, and then you confirm they're Filipino, all of a sudden you're family. So I wanted to ask you guys in your travels or covering, whether it's in the home country or it's abroad, was there ever a moment where being Filipino or having something in your Filipino heritage was an advantage in a story? Did you meet somebody who was Filipino and then could connect you to something, or?
I mean, I'm struggling to think of a specific experience, but certainly I don't, like, I think the only country I've ever been to where I didn't find a Filipino was Somalia. And, but you know, every time you go there, Cuba, my mom's like, oh, come and meet my friend who's been living there for 25 years. And yeah, there's always a Filipino. Like there's you know, you're like, and this has always amazed me. So the last couple of years I've been an editor covering international news. And then there are Filipinos in Damascus during the war that had to be pulled out. There was a Filipino hostage that was taken in Gaza. And it is just this amazing thing where there are Filipino people, you know, absolutely everywhere. And certainly I think, you know, usually if I'm going to Nicaragua or something, I'm not looking for the Filipino story, but there's often Filipinos. You know, like I was living in Morocco at one point and I needed patis, and somebody found the one other Filipino there who had some for me. You know, it's really an incredible diaspora. It really is. It's amazing.
Ambeth was talking about where when Rizal was living abroad, there were no smartphones, there's no cashless transfer. The only way he could get his allowance from the Philippines is if they could talk to a waiter or a crew member on a steamer ship and pass on the money so that eventually he would get it somewhere in Europe.
I'll tell, this one is not to do particularly with the Filipino connection, but the reputation of the Filipino preceding the Filipino. But the very first time I was in Gaza, which was in 2004, I was the first Filipino I think most of them had seen, like, live. But a lot of the people we met were so well-read, very well-educated, that they, knew where the Philippines was, knew a little bit about the history of the Philippines, and that we were a kind of people that were warm and friendly, and they knew this, right? So at one stage, we had to go to a mourning tent for women. The spiritual leader of Hamas had just been killed, and this was his widow's house, and his daughters were there, and nobody obviously was being allowed in to film. But I happened to be with a camera person from CNN who was also female, so both that really helped. But she was American, and I was not. So immediately it was kind of like, who are you? Where are you from? You know, and then I said the Philippines, and they just opened up like you wouldn't believe. We were invited in, we were fed, we were introduced to the family, and it was all because, tell me more about the Philippines. We heard that it's like this there. We heard that it's like that. You have Muslims there too, right? But we know about the Catholics. Tell us more about your faith. And suddenly we became the center of attention there because we were an all-woman crew for a news organization, which they hadn't seen at the time. So that fascinated them. And then the fact that I was not American, and yet here I was working for CNN. So there was a lot of questions. And at that point, what dominated also, aside from, tell us more about the Philippines, was, can you tell us, kind of like as a brother, you know, or as a sister, really, rather, from the same type of brown colored skin or whatever it is, why does the world hate us so much? I got asked that a lot. And how do you answer a group of women asking you why the world hated them so much because nobody did anything to stop their suffering. So that stayed with me, obviously. But, and that really was because I was Filipino, you know.
Yeah? Oh, you have some. Okay.
Maybe I'll just be brief.
Yeah.
Okay. My experience may be a little different because I'm mixed and people probably, they think I don't know what they think I am. Many different things. So it's more often surprise maybe that I even have that background, and I've done a lot of reporting in the Philippines among Filipino communities, but also outside, you know. And one thing I always came across is when they understood, kind of similar, I guess, to what Marga is saying, is I think rightfully so, Filipinos have gotten this reputation for being very friendly and very open and very sharing, you know? So as soon as people heard that, it's like almost everybody I would run into, they knew a Filipino in some capacity of their life, and they always wanted to tell me the story of what that interaction was like or how they knew that person, and that would become a bridge or a place to start a conversation. So that's what I've experienced.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. Do we have any questions from the audience? Please. Thank you, Mba.
Thank you. I thank for all the presentation. It really make me think a lot. My question is probably not really related, but I don't know how many Filipino become migrant workers in Europe. But in Europe, I think the Asian migrant worker is considered like a nice example of migrant worker to be compared with other migrant workers from Africa or Middle East. But sometimes the tension, because Asian workers, because they work hard and they're not complaining a lot, they become like a sample, but then it becomes like a tension between different migrant workers, because the other migrant workers, they don't like being compared with the Asian. My question is whether Filipinos is part of this image and whether you experience the same thing with other migrant workers from other countries. Thank you.
I'm somewhat less familiar with Europe. I live in the UK now, but not particularly sort of immersed in the community. But I have covered migrant workers in the Middle East, and I think that there are, you know, like there are levels and tensions. I spent a lot of time in Lebanon, and I think the Ethiopian migrant workers there were telling me, okay, like there's this hierarchy. The Filipinos are highest because they are speaking English or whatever it is, and then you know the Ethiopians, they're like wildly mistreated in different ways. You know, also in the Gulf areas, I think people sort of enter different sectors of maybe the domestic work, and they'll end up with different treatment from the kind of local population that's hired them in. In terms of the tension between the different ethnicities, you know, like Ethiopian versus Filipino. I know a little bit less about, but I did, you know, like I don't know. I just got my blood taken in London, and the guy was Indian. But because there's so many Filipino nurses there, he's just like, oh, you know, he has all this like, salamat, kumusta, you know, like, do you eat adobo? So that, you know, like I think that I'm sure there are tensions between the different ethnicities. That always happens, and it's unfortunate because we'd all like to see solidarity, you know, but there is also this exchange, you know, between people, and the Nigerians are just like, oh, Manila, I would love to visit Manila, and at first they pronounce it like the word vanilla, which to me is so beautiful because Manila is really known for being quite ugly. And then they pronounce it in this like gorgeous way, and I'm just like, oh yeah, I hope you come. But I think that there is some exchange there that's increasingly positive, like when they're not, sort of pitted against each other for resources and things like that. And I find that really encouraging and beautiful.
Oh, did you want to answer first before I take the?
Would you like? I agree. I agree with what she said. Pretty much it's the same thing. Yeah. I mean, I think it cannot be helped in certain areas where they are competing for jobs or salaries or positions in the workplace. But I think from what I've seen when I was covering, the migrant worker situation in the Middle East and also even in Southeast Asia, is they have hierarchies. And somehow I think because the Filipinos were among the very first to literally export a workforce from the late 70s to 80s, because it was a project then under the first President Marcos. They just had more practice at it. So they were there first in a way. So they were able to move up to managerial positions. So whereas before, for example, Filipinos were the domestic helpers or the caregivers, they have now sort of moved up, if you will, and a lot of them are working in hotels or are working in managerial positions or front of house. So now the housekeepers or those who are doing the more taxing roles in hospitals might be Bangladeshis or Pakistanis, and then, further down in terms of jobs to the newer migrant workforces, so like those from Africa, for example, or other parts of Asia that might not have been part of the original export of labor that started in the 70s and 80s in the Philippines at least. So it's still there, but I believe at the end of the day, because more and more people are just moving around the world now, it's become both easier and more difficult. There is more of an exchange and a possibility for solidarity. Because at the end of the day, I think we're all migrants and we're all moving around. And despite the borders, at the end of the day, everybody just wants to live and just wants to eat and just wants peace and just wants to be happy. And I think the more there is that interpersonal exchange, the more a larger cultural exchange can happen. And so what will it mean to just be Filipino or to just be Indonesian or to just be Japanese when the world is opening up, no matter how much some people might want to keep it shut?
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, but we have to keep it a little brief.
Yeah, this is for Aurora and Dorian. When did you start laughing like Filipinos? And what made you laugh like Filipinos?
Sample lang. Anong ibig sabihin?
When did you start really laughing like a Filipino?
Yeah.
And stop thinking of being a Californian? And when did you start laughing as a Filipino and stop thinking as a Californian?
Oh, that is such a... You want to go first? Okay, I'll go first. That is such a subtle change. But I would say it probably took 2 years of living in Manila. And, everybody speaks some English, if not all English in the Philippines, but it's not really funny until you're getting the Tagalog jokes. And I think that once my Tagalog was really at the point where I could understand it and I was bantering with everybody, then I was laughing like a Filipino. And I think that one of the things that somebody told me once is just like, oh my gosh, the Americans are talking, it's so serious, why no one's laughing, what's going on? When we're hanging out, when we Filipinos are hanging out, masaya. It's funny. We're always having fun. And I think that that's one of the things that I don't know if I've succeeded, but I would love to get across is just the constant sense of humor and joy in the Philippines. It's always a joyful sort of hang. So I would say until my Tagalog got very good, then I could join in on the fun.
Yeah, I love the question as well. And I guess I would just show, I grew up in a family where there was a lot of laughter and a lot of storytelling all the time. You could see in the picture earlier, my elders were always teasing us, joking, and there's a lot of kids running around. So, but I've been going back and forth to the Philippines. I've been living there a long time now. But I still, my family is not Tagalog based, so we have a different language. So it's a double kind of process to get the deep jokes and metaphors in additional languages. But it's a process that's ongoing, and I love it. I enjoy it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Please stick around. We have a performance of the piece Transcendence by Faye Mirabite by Damodar Das Castillo. And then thank you very much for coming, and we hope to see you again soon.
Krishna, Krishna, Hare Hare,
Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.